Welcome, everybody, to today's Building My Legacy podcast. I have with us again today Dr. Turner Osler. He is a trauma surgeon. He is also an epidemiologist. He has published in over 300 refereed journal articles and in books, which is incredible. It's a lot of work to do that kind of publishing. So congratulations to you.
Well, I'll just say I have hardworking residents and medical students. I just like keep them on track. They do most of the real work.
Well, that's good, but you have to be organized. So I'm sharing that because he comes with a perspective of medicine and of what's going on right now with our adapting to COVID. So the question I had for him for today is, we're going to look at two things today in our podcast. One is, what does he see happening with COVID? Explain that a little bit in terms of the real uncertainty that we've all been dealing with, the frustration of that, what kind of course we might anticipate moving forward. And then I want to come back and talk about what's the future of medicine from his perspective. He's an academic physician. He's practiced medicine. So he has a perspective, I think, that is important for us to hear today. So Dr. Osler, let's start with, we were talking a little bit before we began the podcast about the uniqueness of COVID-19 as a virus. So would you just explain that to our audience?
Sure. I might start by saying viruses are kind of unique. They're an amazing, and you almost have to stop and search for a word to describe what it even is, because it isn't really alive, but it kind of behaves like it is. A virus can sit in a jar on the shelf for tens of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years maybe, because it isn't really doing anything. It's just a little packet of information with some delivery stuff attached to it. But once it gets into a host, it invades a cell, and then it subverts the machinery of the cell, not to do what the cell was doing, making muscle protein or digesting glucose. It subverts the cell, so its sole purpose is to make more copies of the virus. And so by stealing all of the machinery and commandeering the whole cell, the virus is able to reproduce itself. And if it can then somehow get from one host to the next, it can really spread quite a long way. And of course, the virus isn't good or evil. It's just information trying to reproduce itself through the world using the hardware that it finds, which is the cells of some host. So it's a very interesting object, and it isn't known even if viruses evolved into living organisms, or if they're viruses kind of were renegade cells that just took off and developed a whole new approach to how they were going to make their way in the world. We can't get to that kind of history because there are no fossils of viruses. Although there are a lot of human DNA is old virus copies of old viruses that we've encountered over the last millions of years. And why we're even storing that in our DNA is sort of a mystery. So the whole, virology is a fascinating topic. But even given that, COVID-19 is a fascinating virus among viruses. It's a wholly new virus, one that we hadn't seen before, which in large measure accounts for why we've had such a spotty track record dealing with it. When we first encountered COVID, we thought, well, maybe it's just comes from animals to people, and it won't be a big problem as long as we stay away from pangolins. Well, turns out it's spread from person to person. Well, it won't be such a big problem if it's just people touching each other. Well, turns out it's spread with particulates or people coughing or sneezing. Much bigger problem, because now one person could infect many, many people. And now, even more lately, we're discovering it's actually spread in aerosols, which can be quite tiny particles that can float around in a room for many hours. So a whole space can become seething with COVID-19 viruses. And now, most recently, we're discovering that you have to have much higher airflows in a room and maybe ultraviolet light, and perhaps you need to give the room a rest every hour or two to clear out all the virus that people may have been breathing or aerosolizing into the room. You don't have to cough or sneeze to get COVID-19 virus into the air. Something like speaking, especially if there are fricatives, where tiny bits of saliva are aerosolized and are projected into the room. Perhaps only a few feet, but as the water evaporates and these little niduses become tinier and tinier and lighter, they waft around in air and can stay airborne for hours. And even if they fall out of the air onto the floor, when people walk along on the floor, creating air currents, COVID virons can be resuspended in the air. So it's keeping track of where these little buggers are is a big problem for us. The business of how we're going to behave to keep ourselves safe gets pretty complicated, because we can't really make a space entirely safe, since every person who is excreting COVID virus can create high concentrations of the virus local to him. So people talk about the room and the plume. There's a viral plume when people speak or cough or sing or yell. Any of these things that can cause small droplets to be expelled from the respiratory tract. Even speaking, because the vocal cords, when they vibrate against each other, aerosolize moisture that's on the vocal cords. So that's the plume that comes out of the person, and then that plume fills up the room. And now you need, you need architects and engineers to try and arrange for airflow that's fast enough to keep the room scrubbed of high concentrations of COVID-19. It turns out just saying the sentence, "Hello world," if you're shedding COVID-19 virus, can spread 30 virons out into the air around you. Well, 30 is probably not an infective dose, so who's so worried? Well, if you keep talking and talking and talking, the concentration builds. So it's a fascinating problem trying to keep people safe, and probably the way to do it is to control it at the source with a mask, and give yourself some extra protection with a mask. And by having 2 masks between someone who's shedding virus and someone who doesn't wish to be infected, the masks aren't additive, they're multiplicative. So if 10% of the virus gets past the speaker's mask and 10% of the virus gets through the listener's mask, then only 1% of the virus made it the whole trip. And that 2 orders of magnitude drop in a viral concentration can be enough to make what would have been an infection not a problem.
So when people are now going back to work, Dr. Osler, given the plume and the way it spreads in the air, what does that really mean? Masks, is that alone sufficient? I know where people are trying to create space, but nonetheless, when you have groups working together, there is, you're looking at a project, you're looking at timesheets, you're looking at reports, and you're on top of each other before you realize it.
So no, it's a big problem. And I think re-engineering workflow is going to be a lot of it. As we're discovering at this moment, you can accomplish a lot being in different rooms. So the notion that we have to be in the same room to get work done needs closer examination. And it may turn out that, what COVID-19 is going to tell us is all that office space in New York City was corporate dollars wasted. Everybody could have been sitting at home, and we could rent that building to some other company. So that's the first thing, is that by re-engineering workflow, maybe we don't need so many people so close together so much of the time. If you happen to have the need to have people in closer proximity, there are several things you can do. One is you can put a mask on everybody very cheaply, and it's immensely effective. It's one of the catastrophes of COVID-19 that early on, in an attempt to save masks for healthcare workers who were the tip of the spear and, in the belly of the beast and needed protection, the message that was passed around was most people don't need them in order to preserve our meager supply of masks for healthcare providers. This was a catastrophic error in messaging. It's never a good idea to lie to people. And it was understood that everybody should be wearing a mask. We were just trying to save masks for those who needed them more. What we should have said is, everybody should be wearing a mask. Let's save the fancy ones for people who are in the hospital, and everybody else can make their own. Had we said that earlier, I think we would have been much better off. But by now we've gotten to the point where pretty much everybody agrees that masks are the cheapest, safest, most effective intervention available to us. And in some mathematical modeling, if everyone were to wear a mask, the R naught, the transmissibility of the virus, falls below 1, which is like the crucial level. If the transmissibility can be driven down below a level of 1, which means on average a person gives the virus to one other person. If that's less than 1, if on average a person gives the virus to a half a person, which is only half the time does a person give the virus to someone else, well, the virus will just peter out organically. And in some modeling, it suggests that if everybody wore a mask scrupulously, that would be enough to suppress the pandemic. So that's top of my list because it's cheap and effective and basically without any side effects. As soon as you vaccinate somebody or do something fancy, you can create a problem that you weren't aware of. But there are basically no problems associated with mask wearing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to keep people as far apart as you can. If they can collaborate over the web, that's perfect. If they need to be in the same room, you can have space in the room. Or better, if they can be out of doors, that almost completely solves the problem. In a large study out of Wuhan, China, they did careful contact tracing for 7,000 cases of COVID-19. And only 2 cases apparently occurred out of doors. Almost every transmission of COVID-19 has occurred indoors. So in some sense, it's not the virus that's the problem. It's humans' proclivity to put themselves in tiny boxes crowded with other people. This is an unusual behavior for our species, which for 3 million years were hunter-gatherers that didn't have any buildings and were out of doors all of the time. If we were out of doors, it wouldn't be an issue for us. But because we're in confined spaces, it's a much bigger problem. So if we can get the number of people down, then we can also re-engineer the space to have bigger airflow. If you can open a window, that's terrific. If you can't, you need your building engineer to turn up the airflow so that the air in the room is swapped out, ideally every few minutes. Typically, it's once or twice an hour. So there's room to run by just replacing the air in the room more frequently. And then the idea is that, and if you have a lot of people in the room, they should leave every hour or two and give the building's circulation a chance to clear out whatever viral plume there might be. So there's the plume of virus particles that come from someone speaking or coughing or laughing or shouting or singing. And then as the water evaporates, these particles become water-free, smaller and lighter, and can waft around for hours in the air. And then the whole room becomes contaminated. The very air in the room becomes contaminated with COVID-19. And this is a problem because COVID-19 is inhaled down through the mouth, down the trachea and into the lungs and settles in the alveoli, which is, where the COVID pneumonia develops and creates such a catastrophe for people. If you get COVID spittle on your forehead, you're fine. It won't get through your skin. But if you inhale COVID-19 virus particles deep into your lung, into your alveoli, this can be a big problem.
So as you watch what's happened, where do you see this moving during the fall and into the winter, which is usually our flu season? people are most vulnerable during this period of time. And what should we anticipate? What do we need to be prepared for? How do we need to think and approach this?
Very smart people have said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And COVID-19 is a hard problem because it doesn't just depend on the virus. It depends on what we do. And if we, decide that we're going to stop going out to bars and stop, singing at karaoke bars, and we're going to wear masks, the future is quite different than if we all go back to carousing at night, unmasked and in crowded spaces. So the question you're asking is really, how are we going to behave as a population? And the answer is, I don't know, but as a Bayesian statistician, my first guess is pretty much we're going to behave the way we used to behave. So you watch college kids, and they pretty quickly, devolve to maskless, fun, because they're kids, and likely they'll be fine. That said, there have been deaths in that demographic, and they certainly aren't invulnerable. And their behavior certainly puts older people at risk by spreading the virus through the population. So we'd prefer that everybody wear masks and so on. What is going to happen? I think that well, it's already happened, right? I mean, we've had colleges open and then slam shut as soon as they had the first 300 cases. So now colleges are trying to open in a little more controlled way, but the problem is there are lead times involved. It takes a week to get sick, and it takes another week to get sick enough to be hospitalized, and it takes a few weeks to die. And so, it's a month that goes by before you see a spike in the deaths. And so it's hard to keep track. However, the Urbana campus of the University of Illinois has put in place a testing regimen where they're going to test every kid on campus twice a week. And according to some mathematical models, if you can test every kid 2 or 3 times a week, you can catch them before they spread very much virus very far. And that may be enough to suppress the virus. How's that even possible? Well, you have to use a different kind of test. The PCR tests that we've been using are terrifically accurate, but they're very expensive, and sometimes they're way oversubscribed, so sometimes it can take a week or longer to get the result back, at which point it's sort of pointless. These more recent point of care tests that detect antigens produced by the coronavirus rather than its RNA are much cheaper and much quicker and can be done like a pregnancy test at home. And so if you can start testing kids like that, then it may be possible to get up and running in something that's much more recognizable as America. That said, it hinges on having these tests widely available, cheap enough that people can afford to do it every day, or maybe have your employer provide it, or maybe have your university provide it. And we know that if you want people to do something that's important, you need to make it very easy for them, ideally free and widely available. So it may just be that cheaper, faster testing will kind of provide enough of a bulwark against COVID-19 that, along with social distancing and masks, can drive the virus down to the point where we stop talking about a pandemic and we just talk about how inconvenient it is. And rather than having people dying at a rate of 1,000 a day, we'll have something that's way less. 1,000 people dying, that's like 3 airplanes crashing. Now, if 3 airplanes are crashing every day, people would be going crazy. Well, I guess we're going pretty crazy over COVID-19 too, but the immediacy of it is, that's a lot of deaths. And that's a way underestimate. We're coming to understand that, as a doctor, when somebody dies and you say, well, did they die of COVID? Well, they had COVID, but they also had an MI and it wasn't so well to start with. What killed it? Well, when you fill out, I filled out many death certificates. It's hard to know what killed somebody because usually there's more than one thing wrong. So who gets credit for the kill, right? Was it his heart attack, or was it the fact that, so in order to get better estimates of how many people COVID-19 is actually killing, the way a statistician would do it is we'd look at how many people died in August of 2019. And then we compare it to how many people died in August of 2020. And then the difference is due to COVID-19. That's the thing that changed between 2019 and 2020. And by doing these differences in overall mortality, you get a much more accurate measure of how many people overall were killed by COVID. That's way over 200,000. So, but these are just numbers, of course. But having accurate numbers is the first step to being able to do mathematical modeling and figuring out what's important if you're trying to stop an epidemic. And that's the kind of mathematical modeling that interests me most. And that's why I'm such a proponent of masks, because when we put things like masks into a model, they really, really are powerful predictors of driving down COVID-19 rates of disease, hospitalization, and death.
The good news as I listened to you talking about that is wearing a mask is pretty simple. It's inconvenient.
And safe and cheap. And actually, we make our own here at home. We take a shop towel. You need a shop towel, 6 staples, and 2 rubber bands, and you can make a mask that's really pretty effective in under 60 seconds.
So I would like you to just say a few words about the push towards vaccines and what you see with that, and the value of it. I'm one of those who has my flu shot every year, but I also know I still may sometimes get a mild flu episode. So if you would speak to that, please.
And so the business of making vaccines is extremely complicated, especially the flu vaccine, because there are different strains of the flu virus. And so every year, the people who make the flu vaccine have to guess months in advance which strain of the flu virus is going to be sweeping through this year, and so which strain of the flu virus we need to target with our vaccine. And they can't target more than 2 or 3 because it gets very complicated to make a vaccine that goes after more than one virus. So some years they get it right and it seems to work better, and some years that we're protected against the wrong kind of flu. So there's that whole thing. COVID-19 doesn't have that problem. It's a single virus, so that's pretty straightforward. And there are over 120 different vaccines in various stages of development now. And and the early signs are that COVID-19 has this big spike protein that is what you see on electron microscopy that makes it look like a crown, which is where corona, the Latin for crown, comes from. That's why it's a coronavirus. If you look at it on scanning EM, it looks like a crown with these spikes sticking up. And the spikes are the things by which it attaches to a cell in order to get inside the cell and steal the machinery. And it turns out that we can make the vaccines that are under development. Almost all of them target this single spike protein, and they do so well, and they make antibody that binds to it. And these early vaccine trials, show that it protects monkeys pretty well, and hamsters are another good model for testing this kind of stuff. And and in humans, when we've given them some of these, the Moderna vaccine, for example, out of Boston, people make a robust antibody response to the vaccine, which suggests it's going to be quite protective against the virus. So it's very likely that we'll be able to have a good vaccine pretty quickly, maybe by early next year. Will that be the best vaccine? it might be that still better vaccines come along, but that's really not a problem. We want to have more than one vaccine in our arsenal. Also, making 300 million doses of the vaccine is going to require a lot of effort. And so, the logistics of making enough vaccines so everybody can have some is a complicated problem. And as you're making vaccine, first you have some and then you have more, but who gets the first doses of vaccine? I mean, you can easily imagine a food fight about, who gets the vaccine. Ethicists and others have thought carefully about these problems, and it seems likely that the plan ought to be to give the vaccine first to the people who are the tip of the spear, healthcare providers who are in the thick of it, and then give the vaccine next to groups that are most at risk, which would be people who are working in slaughterhouses or nursing homes or prisons, where infections have been cataclysmic, and then have the vaccine filter out to other people as it becomes available. So these kinds of considerations are kind of being worked through now. You hope that that Congress doesn't pass a law that they get vaccinated first, but you you have the feeling that the rich and well-connected are going to get vaccinated early. You just have that sense.
Well, yeah, you don't know, and but it's good news to know that you think that the vaccine, because of the nature of the coronavirus, can be targeted and can be effective. So I think that's good news to a lot of
and I got to say that ordinarily a vaccine takes 5 or 10 years, but when the virus was identified in Wuhan, China, some enterprising Chinese scientist put the complete description of the RNA, which is it's like 30,000 base pairs, up on the web for researchers. He was subsequently fired for doing that. Little known fact. But the structure of the viral DNA was immediately available to researchers around the world. The people at Moderna had developed a vaccine platform where they just need to know the what kind of RNA is involved, and they can immediately start making a vaccine. So these men and women at Moderna were making a vaccine within weeks of the virus being identified and sequenced. Unheard of. It's amazing. But they had built this platform because everybody knew that something was going to come down the pike. They just didn't know what it would be. So the idea was to have a platform that could handle any virus that came down the pike. It's a brilliant idea. The downside is this has actually never been done before. So so far it's working great, but we've never actually developed a vaccine based on this platform before. So it'll be, it's nice that we have other irons in the fire, but this is a great one. I just grand rounds here at the University of Vermont last Friday was on COVID-19 vaccines. So a lot to be said about it, but we don't have nearly enough time.
It gives hope, and that's what I think people want right now more than anything is hope. Before we leave our discussion, Dr. Osler, I do want to just briefly, from your perspective, talk about where do you see the future of medicine going? Because I hear so much discussion. I feel a lot of ennui from physicians. And a disquiet about them. And so from your perspective, you've been in the business, your wife is a physician and a rheumatologist, a specialist. Where do you see medicine going? We need doctors. We clearly know that from having gone through COVID. So what do you see happening?
I have to say, I came through the halcyon days of medicine. I had a terrific career doing surgery. I just loved every minute of it, and training residents and medical students. But over time, there were more and more requirements for, filling out paperwork and fighting with insurance companies and, getting certification for this and approval for that and one thing and another. It got to be harder and harder to actually do the business of, operating and taking care of patients, because there were more and more demands that kind of were placed on physicians. So, I watch my colleagues, kind of struggle under the burden of, having to do more paperwork for every day and coming home later and later and going to work earlier and earlier. So that when our son was like finishing it with his degree in computational biology at Cornell, I said, well, you ought to at least apply to some medical school because, you did pretty well in the MCATs. But I didn't really feel like I should try and sell the project to him because I don't really know how medicine's going to be in the next 20 or 50 years. I don't know if it's going to be fun. I don't know if it's going to be fulfilling. I do know that training a physician is expensive. Estimates are $1 to $2 million to train a doctor. So you can't push all that off on kids who are going to medical school, but they push a lot of it off on them. So these kids are getting out of medical school with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And if you add to that their college debt, these kids, and then they start a residency where they get paid nothing. So they aren't actually able to start paying down their debt until they're in their 30s. And then if they're a family practitioner, they might be making $100,000 a year. So, and then we wonder why there aren't any family practitioners. Well, these kids, they want to pay off their debt before they die. So the picture is complicated because, kids go into it because they want to do the right thing. But by the time they get through 4 years of medical school and start looking at a residency, more and more of them are looking at residencies that will allow them to start making money to pay off their debt. So all of a sudden, kids who want to be family practitioners are much more interested in dermatology or orthopedic surgery, neurosurgery, or so. And I think this is a terrible precedent, to have kids' career aspirations so subject to financial constraints. Meanwhile, the United States continues to need a huge influx of physicians, and we've discovered it's much easier to let some person who trained in India, who speaks great English and got good medical training, into the United States. You stamp their visa and you have a doctor for, well, $0 instead of the $2 million it costs to train up a US citizen. But is that really how we want medicine to develop? Most of the fellows in the rheumatology department here at the University of Vermont are FMGs, foreign medical graduates, because rheumatology isn't remunerative enough to, attract students who've come through who went to medical school in the United States. So it's a very complicated picture. And as soon as you are ambivalent about recommending it to your kid, you have to think, boy, what is the future going to be like? And then there are these really big ideas, like a radiologist looks at an X-ray and then tells you about it. Well, there are perfectly good radiologists in India, and they're 12 time zones away. So you could just take all the X-rays from your hospital and send them to India and have the readings back on everybody's desk the next day. And physicians in India work for a pittance compared to hiring a radiologist here in the United States. So there was a huge push to try and get all your X-rays read on another continent. As a surgeon, it was very helpful to be able to go down to the radiology department with some wet film and ask some radiologist to, help me puzzle it out. Something you can't do with somebody in India. But if it's going to be driven solely by financial considerations, outsourcing your X-rays to India makes perfect sense. And a pathologist just looks at a slide and says, this is cancer, it isn't. It's just pattern recognition. There's software to do that. So maybe pathologists will be replaced by really advanced pattern recognition software. It's hard to see how it's all going to develop. But I think we're still going to need smart people to make it all work. So I happen to think it's an exciting time to be in medicine, but you need to have really a broad view of, image recognition and economics and then finally, how do you bring it all home so it actually helps people?
I wanted to close with that because I am very concerned about, as we have healthcare discussions, as we look at things like COVID, and we feel so impacted. Many people feel like they've been out of control because it's so amorphous, and we keep getting information. It changes. It's what happens when something is.
Don't wear a mask. Wear a mask. I don't know.
But part of what we've also seen is the incredible need for wise people who have experience. So it's not just looking at numbers, but it's looking at those numbers with a database in your head that you can say, just a minute, my gut tells me this makes sense, that doesn't make sense. And so we're seeing the value of that. Yet we're not having, I think, a really important, meaningful discussion in our country about our physicians and what do we want from physicians in the future. And I think it's important. And so I just wanted to begin this discussion, and perhaps we'll have more of these discussions and have people in various fields participate in that, because I just think if we don't address it, things will happen and then you regret it later. So let's start talking about what are the issues so we can be proactive.
Well, it's certainly an exciting time, and COVID-19 has really been helpful as a stressor to the system to find out what's working and especially what's not. And as it happens, the mortality for COVID-19 is way under 1%. So although 200,000 people at least and more yet will die in the United States, it's nowhere near the pandemic of 1918. So in some sense, it's just a warning shot over our bow, teaching us where our weaknesses are and what we need to improve on.
Dr. Osler, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful discussion, and I think people will find a great deal of value in it. And those of you who haven't listened to our prior podcast, Dr. Osler has a marvelous product that helps prevent back pain. So go back, listen to that, because you don't want to miss it. Dr. Osler, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to Building My Legacy podcast today.
Thanks, Lois.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell button above. Leave comments. We'd love to hear what you think. And visit our other social media links as well. Thanks much.